Hello, at the general request of one of my terminal students, here is a video about the beginning of the new history lesson. So it takes part in the second theme of the terminal history syllabus, which is called the hard and bitter piece, Bipolarity and Multipolarity from 1945 to 1971, which is quite a mysterious title, but I did not choose that, and hopefully you will understand it better at the end of the chapter. In any case, lesson 1 is pretty clear as far as its focus is concerned, so it's basically a lesson about the beginning of the Cold War, and I have entitled that From World War II to the Cold War, my goal being to show how swift was the transition from World War II to Cold War as a structure of the international relations. Okay, as an introduction, it's important to recall how impressive is this shift from a great alliance to an almost total opposition of models, ideologies, and power between the USA and the USSR. But back to World War II, what was the cement of the Great Alliance was clearly opposition to Nazism in Europe and more generally to fascism all over the world, meaning not only Germany in Italy in Europe, but also Japan in Asia. And so even though the USA and Britain on one side and the USSR on the other side had two greatly contrasted ideologies, one being liberal democracy and capitalism, the other being communism. These camps had in common their opposition to fascism because fascism was seen as a rejection of all the most essential principles of the rights of man, that is to say, those derived from the 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. And so what is, I think, important to understand is that the Great Alliance was about preserving democracy all over the world, or maybe simply fighting a camp that was seen as the enemy of democracy, so the fascists. But the West and the USSR did not have the same definition of what democracy was. And that was one of the ingredients that led almost immediately after World War II to the beginning of the Cold War. Even while World War II was not totally over, well, discussions have taken place showing some disagreements, notably about the future of Germany, but also agreement on some principles, which were the idea that there should be an international institution aiming to coordinate the new world order after World War II around the principles that were derived from this 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. So that would be the United Nations. But as World War II was coming to an end, the division of this great alliance into two sides, so namely the USSR and the USA, as shown on this very clear cartoon from 1945, so just at the end of the war. Opposition between the two greatest powers in the world at the end of World War II was not only an opposition of ideology, but also an opposition of geopolitical power. It was largely power policy. Both the USSR and the USA had gained a new international influence in defeating the fascists, and basically from 1945 they both wanted to keep the international influence that they had gained. And that would lead to the Cold War, I believe you already know that the name Cold War refers to the fact that the USSR and the USA were in conflict but never fought directly against each other. And so it would be a kind of competition and indirect conflict, that developed at all possible levels, economic, diplomatic, political, and military, but never triggered a third world war, actually. And what we will also see in this chapter, I'm talking about the whole theme too, is how structuring the Cold War was. It did not lead to mass disorder in the world. On the contrary, maybe the world was more stable in a way, more clearly divided and clearly structured during the Cold War than since the end of the Cold War. Anyway, back to 1945, and I've called this first part Building a Better World. So one observation was shared by the three members of the Great Alliance, USA, UK, USSR. They were aware that the end of World War I had been totally missed, a total failure. It had been disastrous. The Versailles Treaty and the others had created unfair situations and difficult economic issues that had led to the rise of Hitler and World War II consequently. So as they negotiated about the future of the world while fighting the Germans and the Japanese, they agreed on the fact that they had to create the conditions of a new world order that would be beneficial to the peoples of the world, and that only a fair new world order would help preserve peace as long as possible. So even though, as often, there was a gap between what was officially said and what was really prepared by the governments, but the end of World War II was a short period where some decisions were made that indeed helped the world get better in a way and clearly met the objectives of a trend of progress. In other words, 1945 and the few years that followed are really a crucial moment in the history of the 20th century and very important to understand present, in fact. First example of how important this moment was is the creation of the United Nations, which aimed to be the framework of a new world order that would be multipolar. Multipolar means that the world would not be led by one or two dominant powers, but would be structured by good relations between several powerful countries. And that is the reason why there is a question mark at the end of the title. It is because there was probably a gap between the ideal objectives of the United Nations and the situation of a conflict of power that was emerging between the USA and the USSR. So the United Nations was very symbolically very strong, did a lot of good regarding development, notably, and decolonization, probably, but it did not work very well as long as the Cold War existed. Anyway, the origins of the United Nations. In fact, the real origin of the United Nations is the League of Nations. This is something that was studied in Première. It was the first international permanent institution that should regroup all countries of the world to maintain peace by negotiating, cooperating with each other. But the big problem of the League of Nations was that the USA was absent from it, even though it was a US idea at the beginning. President Roosevelt, President of the USA, was very instrumental in creating the United Nations. And the truth is that he was essentially sharing many ideas of the founding father of the League of Nations, President Wilson, also from the Democratic Party in the USA. Roosevelt was a Wilsonian in the sense that he believed that the USA should have an international role aiming to maintain peace and order in the world. He also believed that this would be good for the USA. This would be in favor of the US interest. This is something we can call internationalism from a US perspective. Anyway, so when Prime Minister Churchill from Britain tried to obtain the intervention of the USA in World War II, he discussed a lot with President Roosevelt, and basically Roosevelt said, okay, we will intervene, but we must agree on what we are fighting for. And that led to the signature of the Atlantic Charter, which very symbolically was signed on a ship in the Atlantic. So it stated the common goals of war of the Allies, which at that moment were only USA and UK. These war goals are detailed in the printed lesson, but the three most important points were that there should be no territorial change made against the will of the peoples, that the peoples of the world should be self-governed. And so here you can see that there was already a contradiction between this idea and the existence of the colonial empires led by some European powers, and notably France and Britain. So Churchill obviously knew that he was about to commit Britain to a political process that implied, if not the end of the British Empire, then clearly transition to a much more democratic and fair functioning of the British Empire that was increasingly called the Commonwealth. And the last goal was the idea that this war should be fought in order to make peace forever. So abandon the use of force and call for the future United Nations. So it was really an American plan to restart the project of League of Nations, giving it another name and play an important role in it. And so the phrase United Nations became, even before the creation of the institution, it became an important slogan for the US war effort. On these posters, you can see that the US Ministry of War, so the US government, clearly insisted on the fact that against fascism, a real alliance of all nations fighting against it, and so for the freedom of the people, should be organized. And if you look carefully at these posters, you can see that on them is present the flag of the USSR. Because after Germany attacked the USSR in June 1941, now clearly the USSR joined the Great Alliance as well. So it's really exceptional to see, notably on the left side, a poster that associates the flag of the USA, the Statue of Liberty, and the flag of the USSR as well. So the United Nations was rooted in the common struggle of the Great Alliance against fascism. And so when fascism, Nazism, Japan were defeated in 1945, immediately the United Nations was created, and as if to prove and to be coherent with the fact that it was an American idea. The headquarters of the USA were settled in New York City, and that's a very famous building, a tower of glass that you can see on the left on the picture here. The creation of the United Nations was quickly followed by the writing of a text that summarized the principles that the United Nations would stand for. This text, called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is a clear legacy of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens. So that's a direct result of the 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. You can see on this picture the widow of President Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, holding a poster of this declaration. And I chose this picture just to recall the importance of Roosevelt in the making of this text and of the UN in general, and also the fact that there was a propaganda around the creation of the United Nations and these ideas in the late 40s. On this other picture here, you can see that this a poster of the declaration was published in schools as well. So it was important to publicize the fact that an international organization based on anti-fascist principles, humanist principles, democratic principles was being set up. Here are some important articles from it. All articles are important, obviously, but those that I have selected here demonstrate clearly the direct link with the Enlightenment philosophy and the French Declaration of Human Rights. So it's Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. In a way, we can say the writing of the declaration as something a bit Christian in the widest sense of the term. Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. In other words, it proclaims equality. It is clearly a rejection of the fascist ideologies that rejected the idea of equality between men and peoples. And I would say it was a very modern political statement. You can object that those principles are not met at a satisfactory level in most countries of the world today. It is absolutely true. But the fact that they were proclaimed just after World War II, I think, is very important basis that shows the objectives of what governments and international relations should be. And yes, of course, it is a constant struggle, which is not going very well at the moment, by the way. Or take Article 21, everyone has the right to take part in the government of his country, directly or through freely chosen representatives. That's clearly a praise for democratic governments to be the model of all governments of the world. It has not led to an extremely successful spreading of democracy all over the world. Also because democracy is something that is never pure and clear. It's always an objective democracy. In fact, I would not be surprised if we could read nowadays the term democracy in almost each and every constitution in the world. It does not mean that in reality people are really free and participate actively in government, but at least it's an objective. And that's also interesting if we go back to the period of the late 40s, because there was now clearly in the UN the expression of this problem of a contradiction existing between these democratic principles, notably supported by France and Britain, and the existence of their colonial empires, where the people from the colonies were not yet endorsed with equal rights as the people from the colonial power. This contradiction and solving this contradiction would be an important motor of the historical trend that would carry on until the 70s, actually, that we call decolonization. But this is something we will discuss a bit later. And the United Nations was not only based on the text, it was also a very concrete organization of institutions that worked in a way like a democratic government of the world. Of course, it was not, because the sovereignty still belongs to the states, and the UN is not sovereign. But a great work of organization was done as soon as the late 40s. So here is the basic framework of how the UN were built and how they work. At the basis, you have the member states, all the states of the world that agreed to join the United Nations, which today means, if I'm not wrong, almost all states in the world. In those days, some continents were absent because Africa, in particular, was mostly consisting in colonies of European countries. Anyway, the member states are all present in the General Assembly, which works in a democratic way, as one state has one vote, no matter what is the size of this state. At this point, it's important to make a distinction between the UN and a real government. Obviously, the Assembly does not have legislative power, simply because it has actually no power. But it's an assembly, and so the role of an assembly is to deliberate and to write some laws. So obviously, when it comes to the international level, you can't talk about laws as you can talk about them in the context of one state. But that was one of the important goals of the UN. If we want some rules to be respected at world level, then these rules would be written. And in the vocabulary of the UN, we call that resolutions. Of course, all states do not follow them. A bit like in a society, you don't follow the law absolutely 100% every minute of your life. And from the General Assembly, several other institutions emerged. The General Secretary is the permanent administration of the UN. It's always open. It exists above the states in a way, even though it has no power over the state. But it's totally multilateral. Okay, it represents, it defends not the interest of each and every state, but the interest of the world actually. Then you have the Security Council, whose role is directly to adopt resolutions on geopolitics in order to avoid wars. And here the functioning is not democratic. But there was a compromise. Clearly, the victors of World War II have a special situation in the Security Council, and also a special situation today. So we are still in a world where the UN is based on what happened during World War II. So in the Security Council, you have 5 permanent members: USA, USSR, UK, France, and China, who are more powerful than the others because each of them has a veto on the resolutions made by the Council. So if one country says no, then the resolution can't be voted. There are also non-permanent members. Their number has increased several times since 1945, and they are elected for 2 years only. So you see here a difference in the status of the countries. There is an International Court of Justice whose role is to settle disputes and also to make recommendations. And there is the Economic and Social Council, which coordinates a long list of agencies whose role is to work on improving the world, in a way. Improving what we would call in geography standards of living, development levels, and these agencies, created in the late 40s, for most of them still exist today, and you know them. So you have the UNESCO, which is about helping on questions of education, culture, and things like this. The UNICEF, which is for protection of children. The FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, which tries to help farmers of the world in order to avoid famines, which were very frequent and were really a major issue 70 years ago, less today. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are financial institutions which are not private, they are not banks, because they are controlled, managed by the states of the world. But basically, they act like banks that can lend money to other countries, to individual countries, in order to help them when they have problems with their currencies. That's the role of the IMF, and problems or simply projects of building infrastructure and so on. That's the role of the World Bank. And in fact, all these institutions created 70 years ago are pretty useful even today. So that is really a very important point in history. And I forgot, sorry, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, and you have heard a lot of it during the pandemic. That's the UN. Ideally, it should work as a kind of government of the world. If it worked perfectly well, there would be no war. As you know, there have been several wars since the end of World War II, even if it never led to a global war. But this proves that the UN has not been working as well as it could have been. And for 40 years, until the late 80s, the reason why the UN did not work very well, at least regarding the maintaining of peace, was the conflict between the USA and the USSR, both being permanent members of the Security Council with a veto. They prevented the Security Council from working effectively. Okay, that was one first video about the making of the United Nations. There will be other ones about the B and C parts a bit later, I'm afraid, because it takes time to record them, and also then after that to put them in the right format, of video format, and then upload them on YouTube. So you will have them, but not as soon as expected, unfortunately.